Hello everybody, myself Dr. Shivkumar Biswarapur, Associate Professor and Research Guide, Department of Education, Karnataka State Akkamadevi Women's University, Vijaypura. Today we shall discuss about sampling methods in research. A sample is a subset of the population that represents the entire group. A population may be defined as an aggregate of individuals possessing a common trait or traits. So please bear in mind about the sample and population. When the population is too large for the researcher to survey all its members because of its cost, the number of personnel to be employed, or the time constraint, a small, carefully chosen sample is extracted to represent the whole. Now, classification of sampling methods. There are two methods of sampling. One is probability sampling and non-probability sampling. Let's take probability sampling. Here, if the purpose of research is to draw conclusions or make predictions affecting the population as a whole, then one must use probability sampling. Now, non-probability sampling. Here, if one only interested in exploring how a small group, perhaps even a representative group, is doing for purposes of illustration or explanation, then one may use non-probability sampling. I repeat, probability sampling. Here, if the purpose of research is to draw conclusions or make predictions affecting the population as a whole, then one must use probability sampling. Non-probability sampling. Here, if one only interested in exploring how a small group, perhaps even a representative group, is doing for purposes of illustration or explanation, then one might use non-probability sampling. Probability sampling. Each member of the population has a known non-zero probability of being selected. The key point behind all probabilistic sampling approaches is random selection. So all member of the population has the equal opposite to being selected. That is a random selection. Number three, the advantage of probability sampling approaches is that sampling error can be calculated, which is the degree to which a sample might differ from the population. Probability sampling methods include random sampling, systematic sampling, and stratified sampling. Let us take random sampling. It is the purest form of probability sampling. Each member of the population has an equal and known chance of being selected. Next point, random selection is effective in a clearly defined population that is relatively small and self-contained. When the population is large, it is often difficult or impossible to identify each and every member. So, the assemblies of available subjects becomes biased. One obtains a list of all residents or the voters list or telephone directory and then selects a sample using a sequence of numbers from a random numbers table. Random numbers can also be created in numerous computer software. B. Systematic sampling. It also called an nth name selection technique. Every nth record is selected from a list of population members. Its only advantage over the random sampling technique is its simplicity. The first number has been selected by a random number followed by the selection of every fifth item in the series. It is frequently used to select a specified number of records from a computer file. C. Stratified sampling is a commonly used probability method that is superior to random sampling because it reduces the sampling error. A stratum is a subset of the population that shares at least one common characteristics. Example, males or females. The researcher identifies the relevant strata and their actual representation in the population. Random sampling is then used to select a sufficient number of subjects from each stratum. Researchers should confident strata should represent the population. Next, cluster random sampling is used when the population is dispersed across a wide geographic region. This method allows to divide the population into clusters and then select the clusters at random. Thereafter, one can either study all the members of the selected clusters or again take random, simple or systematic. Samples of these sampled clusters at this stage is also called multi-stage sampling. For example, if researchers study a tribal group or a community that is dispersed, the villages could be used as clusters and can be randomly selected. From each cluster, samples is selected by a random number. Then coming to the non-probability sampling. In non-probability sampling, members are selected from the population in some non-random manner. In this method, the degree to which the sample differs from the population remains unknown. Non-probability methods include convenience sampling, judgment sampling, quota sampling, and snowball sampling. Let us take convenience sampling. Convenience sampling. As the name implies, the sample is selected because it is convenient. It is also called haphazard or accidental. This method is based on using people who are a captive audience, just happen to be walking by or show a special interest in research. This method is often used during preliminary research efforts to get a gross estimate of the results without incurring the cost or time required to select a random sample. This is used in exploratory research where the investigator is interested in getting an inexpensive approximation of the fact. B. Judgment sampling is a common non-probability method. The researcher selects the sample based on judgment. This is extension of convenience sampling. For example, a researcher may decide to draw the entire sample from one representative village, even though the population may be distributed over a number of villages. When using this method, the researcher feels that the chosen sample is representative of the entire population. I repeat, this is extension of convenience sampling. For example, a researcher may decide to draw the entire sample from one representative village, even though the population may be distributed over a number of villages. So, based on the judgment, he selects the sample. Next, purposive sample. It is much similar to judgment sampling. Is when the researcher targets a group of people believed to be typical or average, or a group specifically or specially picked for some unique purposes. I repeat, it is much similar to judgment sampling. Is when the researcher targets a group of people believed to be typical or average, or a group specially picked for some unique purposes. The researcher never knows if the sample is representative of the population, and the method is largely limited to exploratory research. Now coming to the quota sampling is the non-probability equivalent of stratified sampling. Like stratified sampling, the researcher first identifies the strata and their proportions in the population. The convenience or judgment sampling is used to select the required number of subjects from each stratum. Now coming to the next, snowball sampling is a special non-probability method used when the desired sample characteristics is rare. It may be extremely difficult or cost prohibitive to locate respondents in these situations. Snowball sampling relies on referrals from initial subjects to generate additional subjects. In other words, snowball sampling comprises identification of respondents who in turn refer researchers to other respondents. This technique provides a means to access relatively invisible and vulnerable social groups. It leads to introducing bias because the technique itself reduces the likelihood that the sample will represent a good cross section of the population. For example, an investigator finds a rare genetic trait in a person and starts tracing his pedigree to understand the origin, inheritance, and etiology of the disease. So it is used when desired sample characteristics is rare. So please keep in mind desired sample characteristics is rare. So snowball sampling relies on reference from initial subjects to generate additional subjects. It may be extremely difficult or cost prohibitive to locate respondents in these situations. So this is what very rare sampling method. Now, what are the benefits of good sample? A well-selected sample may provide superior results. A sample should represent population. A sample should not be research bias. A sample should be well defined. A sample should lead to conclusion. So thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. Wear the mask and maintain the social distance. Thank you and all.